Each year, the world turns green. Parades fill the streets, rivers are dyed, and glasses are raised to St. Patrick, the man who brought Christianity to Ireland. A celebration of faith, of heritage, of a story that has been told for centuries. We are told that Patrick drove the snakes from Ireland, casting them into the sea. But there were no snakes. There never had been. So what exactly was banished? Before Patrick, Ireland was a land of sacred groves and whispered spells, of Druids who held knowledge older than Rome, a place where gods and spirits moved through mist and fire. Patrick did not come to an empty land. He came to a land of gods and left it a land of one God. Should we celebrate him or mourn what was lost? Before Patrick, before the cross, there was a different Ireland. An Ireland ruled not by kings but by sacred cycles, by the turning of the sun, the pull of the moon, and the old gods who lived within them. It was a land without written histories, but not without knowledge. Instead, the past lived in the voices of its keepers, passed from elder to apprentice, from druid to chieftain, from mother to daughter. These were the Druids, the intermediaries between the mortal and the divine. They were priests, judges, healers, astronomers, and poets, wielding power not through swords but through words. They moved unseen, whispering to kings and standing watch over ceremonies that had endured for centuries. The Romans feared them, writing of their dark rites, their human sacrifices, their unsettling control over Ireland's scattered tribes. But to the Irish, the Druids were not merely priests. They were the bridge between the living and the gods. Their gods were many. Some whispered from deep within the rivers, like Boan, whose rushing waters shaped the land itself. Others lurked in dark forests, where twisted roots and the gnarled branches of oak trees were seen as the very veins of the earth. Some, like Lugh, the warrior of light, were said to walk among men, wielding gifts of wisdom and war. But among them, it was the goddesses who held the greatest power. Brigid, Danu, the Morrigan, figures both maternal and terrible, keepers of fire, sovereignty, and fate. Their names were whispered in times of birth and death, in the forging of weapons and the healing of wounds. Brigid, with her fires of inspiration and hearth, was said to bless poets and blacksmiths alike, her presence felt in every flickering flame. Danu, the Great Mother, flowed through the rivers and the land itself, nourishing all who honored her. The Morrigan, a spectral figure who shifted between maiden, mother, and crone, foretold doom on the battlefield, her ravens circling over the dying. Their temples were not built from stone, but from the land itself. There were no towering cathedrals, no sanctuaries enclosed by walls. Instead, the holy places were woven into nature, wells that bubbled from the earth, groves where sunlight split the leaves, standing stones older than memory. These places were sacred because they had always been. Water was revered as a passage to the other world. Holy wells, dark and still, were said to hold the voices of spirits and gods, their depths an entrance to realms beyond human sight. The forests too were hallowed ground, their oaks, yews, and hawthorns considered homes to divine forces. Even the hills themselves were places of worship, believed to be the domains of the IOC, the spirits who lingered between the world of gods and men. And then there were the stones, massive, weathered, covered in swirling carvings whose meanings have long since faded. Some were aligned to catch the sun at precise moments, marking the shifting of the seasons. These stones were not placed by accident. They were aligned to something greater, to the unseen mechanics of time, to the great wheel that governed all things. Because for the people of this land, time was not linear. It moved in cycles like the moon, like the tides, like life itself. The seasons turned, death gave way to rebirth, and the sacred festivals ensured balance between the seen and the unseen. There were 4 great turning points of the year, each marked by fire and ritual. Imbolc, the promise of spring, when the land stirred beneath frost and Brigid's blessing was sought. Beltane, when the veils between worlds thinned and the fires of renewal burned high on the hills. Lugnasad, the time of harvest, when the god Lu was honored for his gifts of skill and battle. And Sarwyn, the end and the beginning, the night when spirits walked freely and the old year died so the new one could be born. But among these, one moment stood apart: the equinox. Twice a year, the day and night stood equal, a moment of balance, a pause between light and darkness. The ancients knew its significance. At Newgrange, a burial mound older than the pyramids, the rising sun on the winter solstice pierces through a narrow passage, illuminating the chamber inside for mere minutes, a design too precise to be coincidence. The spring equinox was no less important. It was a time of awakening, of fertility, of honoring the forces that brought life back to the land. It was when Cernunnos, the horned god, was said to stir, and when the rivers swelled with the melting frost of winter's grasp. It was when the first shoots of green emerged from the earth, a sign that the darkness had passed. And yet, how many today mark this day? How many recognize the significance of the equinox, a moment so important that even the stones were set to remember it? Instead, another celebration would rise, one marked not by fire and stars, but by the sign of the cross. It is said that St. Patrick's Day falls on March 17th because it is the date of his death, a Christian holiday set apart from the cycles of the earth. And yet it hovers near an older time, near the equinox, near the moment when light and darkness hang in balance. Coincidence, or something more? In the end, the stories that survive are the ones that are told. The gods that endure are the ones that are named. And those that are forgotten, they slip into silence, waiting for the day when someone will listen again. The gods of Ireland had ruled for centuries, their names spoken in whispered prayers, their stories etched into stone and sung in the halls of kings. But change was coming, not by sword, but by word, not by conquest, but by conversion. And it came in the form of a man whose story, like so many others, has been rewritten over time: St. Patrick. Patrick was not Irish. He was not born among the windswept hills of Eire, nor did he grow up listening to the voices of the Druids. He was a foreigner, a Roman Briton, raised in the world of empire and faith. His name was not even Patrick. He was born Maewyn Succat, sometime in the late 4th or early 5th century, in what is now likely Wales or Western Britain. His family was Christian but not priests or monks. His father, Calpurnius, was a deacon. His grandfather, a priest. His was a world where Christianity had already begun to settle its roots, spreading across Roman lands like ivy climbing old stone. But Patrick was not particularly religious as a child. He did not dream of conversion or of bringing the word of God to distant lands. And then the world changed. Raiders came. From across the Irish Sea, they swept through the settlements of Britain, taking what they wanted: cattle, goods, gold, and people. Patrick was 16 when they came for him, ripped from his home, thrown onto a ship bound for the western edge of the known world. When he stepped onto Irish soil, it was not as a missionary, not as a saint. It was as a slave. For 6 years he lived among the people who had taken him, tending sheep on the cold hills of Ireland. Alone, exposed to the elements, to the hunger of wolves and the bite of frost, to a land that spoke in a language he did not know. It was here in the silence of captivity that his faith grew. He later wrote that he prayed constantly, morning, noon, night. And then, one night, a voice, a dream, a vision, telling him to flee, to run for the coast, to find a ship that would take him home. And so he did. He escaped. Across miles of untamed land, slipping past chieftains and warriors, avoiding the eyes of the men who would drag him back into bondage. When he reached the coast, a ship was waiting. He convinced the crew to take him. They sailed and he left Ireland behind. But something had taken hold of him, something he could not shake. Ireland was not done with him. He returned to Britain, to his family, to the safety of a world he had lost. But his dreams followed him. He spoke of visions, of voices calling him back. The people of Ireland, he claimed, were begging for his return. "Come back, Patrick, walk among us once more, bring us the light." He trained as a priest, became a bishop. And when he set sail for Ireland again, it was not as a prisoner, it was as a man on a mission that would change everything. The Christianization of Ireland is often told as a story of peace, that Patrick walked among the people and spoke with them, that they listened, that they welcomed his God with open arms, that the transition from the old gods to the new was inevitable. But history is rarely so simple. Ireland was not a land waiting to be saved. It was not a people in need of a new faith. It was a land of gods, of druids who held the knowledge of generations, of kings who traced their lineages back to divine ancestors. And Patrick had not come to exist alongside them. He had come to replace them. He sought to convert the kings, knowing that where a ruler went, his people would follow. He baptized thousands, preached in courts, spoke before chieftains who held the fate of entire clans in their hands. Some welcomed him, some did not. There are stories of druidic prophecies that foretold Patrick's coming, that the old gods had warned of a foreign priest who would bring a new faith, who would challenge their dominion. Some druids opposed him, resisting his teachings, warning their people that to follow this new god was to betray the old ones. And yet, Patrick's influence spread, not just through words, but through a calculated dismantling of the old beliefs. Sacred wells, once the domain of goddesses, were rebranded as holy springs blessed by saints. Ancient sites of worship were repurposed for Christian use. Even Brigid, once a powerful goddess of fire and fertility, was rewritten into Saint Brigid, a servant of Christ. He burned druidic books, though few written records existed. What knowledge was lost in those flames, we will never know. What spells, what histories, what stories of gods who are now little more than whispers in the wind. Patrick's legend was not built alone. He was not the first missionary to set foot on Irish soil. Before him there was another, Palladius, a bishop sent by the Pope in 431 AD, nearly a decade before Patrick arrived. Some historians argue that Patrick's story absorbed that of Palladius, that their missions overlapped, that Patrick's legend was magnified over time. But Patrick endured in memory. His story, whether entirely his or borrowed from others, took hold. And so, the gods faded. The Druids, once the most powerful force in Ireland, became shadows, their influence dwindling until they existed only in myth. The sacred fires of Beltane were no longer lit in honor of the old ways, but in quiet remembrance of what had been. Patrick had returned to Ireland to bring salvation. But what he left behind was something else entirely, the slow, steady erasure of a world that had existed long before him. Patrick had returned to Ireland to bring salvation, but what he left behind was something else entirely, the slow, steady erasure of a world that had existed long before him. The gods, the rites, the sacred words passed from druid to disciple. All began to fade. But a good story does not simply tell of change, it justifies it. Ireland has no snakes, it never did. There are no fossils of twisting coils buried beneath its soil, no ancient records of vipers curling in the sun. Yet the story remains. St. Patrick, the man of God, drove the serpents from Ireland, casting them into the sea, never to return. It is a story of triumph, told with certainty. A miracle, proof of divine favor. Patrick, armed with the cross, purges the land of its most wicked creatures. It is a story so ingrained in popular imagination that few stop to question it. But if there were no snakes, what was he really banishing? Legends do not survive on accident. They evolve, sharpened over centuries, shaping the way history is remembered and the way it is forgotten. If the snakes were never real, then what do they represent? Some say it is simply a metaphor for the expulsion of sin, a retelling of biblical themes, a parallel to Moses and the serpent-bearing staff. But there is another explanation, one that lingers beneath the surface, unspoken, just out of reach. The serpents were not animals, they were people. The Druids were known to carry the symbol of the serpent, their wisdom often linked to its coiled form. To the Romans, the Druids were sorcerers, conjurers of strange rites, men and women who held power without the need for kings. They were priests without churches, scholars without scripture, their knowledge forbidden to all but their chosen initiates. They did not write their wisdom down, trusting only in memory, in sacred recitations, in the hushed secrets passed from teacher to student. And so, when the Druids vanished, their knowledge vanished with them. No burned books, no shattered temples, just silence. But there are hints, fragments buried in the oldest stories. Celtic gods entwined with serpents, standing stones carved with twisting coils, the figure of the Cailleach, the ancient veiled one, who shaped the hills and rivers and carried a staff said to control the storms. The serpent was not merely a creature in Ireland's past, it was a symbol of transformation, wisdom, power. And Patrick, whether by legend or by careful construction, did not just drive snakes from Ireland. He drove out the old gods. This is how stories are rewritten. The Christianization of Ireland was not just a conversion, it was a conquest of memory. To tell the people that their gods were vanquished was one thing. To tell them they had been monsters all along was something else entirely. The process of religious transformation is rarely immediate. The Druids did not disappear overnight, nor did the old belief simply collapse at the first sign of the cross. Instead, they were diminished, reshaped, absorbed. But some things could not be rebranded. Some things had to be purged. The Druids were not assimilated. Their teachings, their rituals, their rites all faded, remembered only in whispers, in half-truths, in the fearful warnings of later generations. And in their place, the legend of the snakes endured. What was lost when the serpents were cast into the sea? Knowledge of the stars, of the movement of time, of the balance between the seen and unseen. The oral traditions that once carried the voices of the past, now silenced beneath new stories. The belief that the divine could be found not in a single god, but in the hills, the rivers, the fire, and the wind. To those who tell his story, St. Patrick is a man of faith, a figure of light who spread truth where once there was only darkness. But to those who look closer, he is something else. A man who did not merely bring a new god to Ireland, but one who ensured the old gods were forgotten. And if they were forgotten, does that mean they are truly gone? Or are they only waiting, beneath the hills, beneath the water where the snakes were sent so long ago? The old gods were not slain in battle. They were not defeated by war, nor were their temples burned to the ground. Instead, they were rewritten, their names softened, their symbols repurposed, their power dissolved into something that could be safely controlled. The Christianization of Ireland was not a war of swords. It was a war of stories. Some things could be erased. Others had to be rebranded. Patrick, it is said, used the shamrock to explain the Holy Trinity, 3 leaves, 1 plant, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, distinct yet united. It is a charming legend, taught to children, passed from one generation to the next. But before Patrick, long before the first Christian prayers were whispered in Ireland, the shamrock had already carried meaning. To the Druids, 3 was sacred: the land, sea, and sky, the phases of the moon, the threefold nature of many gods and goddesses. It was a number of power, of completeness, of the delicate balance that governed all things. Patrick's shamrock may well have been an effective teaching tool, but was it a Christian idea at all? Or was it something older, borrowed, repackaged, and presented as if it had always belonged to the new faith? It was not the only thing taken. Ancient standing stones, once places of sacrifice and prayer, were carved with crosses. Churches rose over burial mounds. Monasteries were built atop sacred groves. It was a pattern not unique to Ireland. The Christian world was built upon the foundations of what came before it. In Rome, the winter festival of Saturnalia, a time of feasting, merriment, and the reversal of social order, was repurposed. The date, the customs, the spirit of the event were woven into something new, something Christian. Christmas was born, set just days after the solstice, aligned so closely with pagan tradition that even centuries later, echoes of the old ways remain. Easter, too, carries the marks of an older faith. The name itself may be linked to Eostra, an Anglo-Saxon goddess of dawn and fertility. The eggs, the rabbits, the symbols of renewal, these were not Christian in origin. They belonged to something older, something that had existed long before the resurrection of Christ was ever proclaimed. And then there is All Hallows' Eve, better known today as Halloween. A night of spirits, of wandering souls, of flickering lights in the darkness. Before it was the eve of a Christian holiday, it was Samhain, the great turning of the year in the Celtic world. A time when the dead walked, when the veil between the worlds was thin, when the fires burned high against the gathering dark. The bones of the old beliefs still remain, hidden beneath costumes and carved pumpkins, disguised yet never fully forgotten. Ireland was no different. The same tactics were used, the same slow erasure, the same careful folding of old rites into new doctrine. There are some who say this was kindness, that it was a gesture of inclusion, of adaptation, of making the transition from paganism to Christianity as painless as possible. Perhaps. But there is another way to see it. The sacred places of Ireland were not destroyed because they were not feared. They were transformed because their power remained. If the old gods were truly dead, there would have been no need to bury them in Christian names. If the old ways had truly lost their hold, there would have been no need to claim their symbols, their stories, their very essence. The churches, the saints, the festivals, they did not erase the old gods completely. Instead, they folded them into a new narrative, one where they could no longer speak, where their voices were drowned beneath the sound of ringing bells. But a whisper is not silence, and things that are buried do not always stay that way. The old gods had been buried beneath new names. The sacred wells now bore the blessings of saints, the standing stones had been marked with crosses, and the fires that once burned for Brigid now flickered in the hearths of convents. It was to many a peaceful transition, a slow fading of one world into another. But conversion is rarely so gentle. The image of St. Patrick that endures is that of a wise and patient missionary, a man who spread Christianity through words, not war. But what does history remember of those who resisted? What of the ones who would not bow, who clung to the old ways, who refused baptism and the sign of the cross? Their stories are harder to find, but they exist, buried between the lines of history. There are whispers of forced baptisms, of kings who were compelled to accept Christianity or risk losing their thrones, of Druids who defied Patrick and found themselves outnumbered, their influence eroded, their voices silenced. Patrick's own writings speak of opposition. He was threatened, imprisoned, attacked. Whether by those who resisted conversion or by rival Christian factions is uncertain. But what is clear is that the Ireland he sought to change did not always welcome him with open arms. The destruction of pagan shrines is an uncomfortable truth. Patrick's legend tells of him lighting the Paschal fire on the Hill of Slain, a direct challenge to the pagan festival fires that burned for the high kings at Tara. A symbolic act of defiance, a message that the old gods had been replaced. Christian hagiographies, stories of saints meant to inspire the faithful, speak of Patrick cursing Druids, breaking their power, even casting one into the earth itself. Legends paint these acts as miracles, triumphs of good over evil. But from another perspective, they tell the story of a religion asserting dominance, stamping out what came before. This was not an isolated event. Across Europe, pagan temples were destroyed or repurposed, their priests driven into hiding, their rites condemned as heresy. Ireland was spared much of the bloodshed seen in other lands. It had no great battles for the soul of the nation, no recorded mass executions of those who refused to convert. But it did not escape the slow, deliberate dismantling of its native beliefs. And yet, Patrick's story does not end in the 5th century. In many ways, it was just beginning. For centuries, Patrick remained Ireland's saint. Not the only one, but the most famous, his story growing grander with each retelling. But in the centuries that followed, his image was reshaped, repurposed, not just as a religious figure, but as a political one. By the time the British Empire tightened its grip on Ireland, St. Patrick had been recast, not as the patron saint of a proud, independent people, but as a symbol of civilization itself. The English justified their control over Ireland through a narrative of superiority, that the Irish without them were wild, unruly, uncivilized. And here, Patrick's legend became useful. He had tamed Ireland before. He had brought light to a land of darkness. He had driven out the serpents, the Druids, the chaos. Now the British positioned themselves as following in his footsteps, bringing order where there was none. Under British rule, Irish identity itself was fractured. The Protestant ruling class promoted Patrick not as a symbol of Ireland, but as a missionary of empire, a man who had saved the island from ignorance. And among the Catholic Irish, the story shifted as well. Patrick was no longer simply the man who brought Christianity to Ireland. He became a symbol of resistance, of national identity, of Catholic defiance against Protestant rule. By the 17th and 18th centuries, St. Patrick's Day was no longer just a religious feast. It had become something more. It was a day for Irish Catholics to assert their faith in a country where Protestantism had been imposed by force. It was an act of defiance, a quiet reminder that Ireland's true faith, its true identity, had not been erased. And so Patrick's legacy became a paradox. Was he the man who brought Ireland together under one faith, or the man whose story was used to justify its division? Was he the protector of Irish identity, or the first tool in its erasure? Even today, the contradictions remain. St. Patrick's Day is a celebration of Ireland, but one that owes its existence to a man who sought to make Ireland something else entirely. What does it mean to celebrate him now? To wear green, to march in parades, to lift a glass to his name? Is it a tribute to Ireland's resilience, or a memorial to what was lost? That perhaps depends on who is telling the story. St. Patrick's Day began as a celebration of conversion, a feast for a saint who had brought Christianity to Ireland, who had ensured the old gods would fade into silence. And yet, in a twist of history, the very day meant to honor his victory has become something else entirely. Not everyone raises a glass on March 17th. For some, it is not a day of celebration, but of mourning. A reminder of what was lost, not only the gods and the Druids, but an entire way of understanding the world. The sacred groves, the whispered spells, the balance between earth and spirit, all pushed aside in favor of a single faith. But the old ways have not vanished completely. In recent decades, there has been a quiet revival, a reawakening of the gods thought long dead, a rediscovery of rites once declared forgotten. It began in whispers. In the 18th and 19th centuries, romantic writers and folklorists turned their attention to Ireland's past, collecting stories that had survived in the margins, passed down through generations. Myths that had been stripped of their power by Christian scribes, tamed into mere folk tales, were read again with new eyes. The names of the old gods buried for centuries were spoken once more. And then in the 20th century, something changed. Druidry was reborn, not as it had been, for too much had been lost, but as a modern spiritual movement, an attempt to reclaim what had been taken. Some looked to archaeology, piecing together fragments of pre-Christian belief. Others turned to intuition, to dream, to vision, believing that the gods still lingered, waiting to be remembered. Modern Celtic paganism, often called Druidry or Reconstructionism, seeks to honor the spirits of the land, to restore balance with nature, to rekindle the fire that once burned in Brigid's name. Festivals once thought consigned to history, Imbolc, Beltane, Lugnasad, Soar In, are celebrated again, not in secret, but openly, proudly. And with this revival, St. Patrick's Day has taken on new meaning. Some refuse to celebrate it entirely. To them, March 17th is a day of conquest, a reminder of erasure. In Ireland, some pagans call it All Snakes' Day, a defiant reversal of the old legend, a way of honoring the Druids who were never truly driven from the land. But others take a different approach. They do not reject the holiday but reclaim it. After all, St. Patrick's Day has long since ceased to be a purely religious occasion. It is no longer only about conversion, it is about identity, about heritage, about a culture that has endured despite centuries of colonization and suppression. For some, to celebrate Ireland is to remember all of Ireland, not just what survived, but what was nearly lost. It is to honor the gods alongside the saints, to walk between two worlds, just as their ancestors once did. And so the contradiction lingers. A holiday meant to celebrate the triumph of Christianity over paganism has, in some ways, become a platform for remembering what was erased. The fires of Beltane burn again. The old names are spoken. The snakes have returned. Perhaps in the end, they were never truly gone. St. Patrick's story is more than a legend. It is a narrative of conquest, a reminder of how belief can be reshaped, how gods can be silenced, not by war but by words. And yet Ireland endured. Its identity was not erased, even as its faith was transformed. Now the past stirs. Historians sift through fragments, pagans call upon forgotten names, and seekers question the stories they were told. St. Patrick's Day remains, but what does it mean? Is it a celebration of faith? A relic of religious dominance? A day to honor what was lost or to reclaim it? Perhaps in the end, the question is not whether Patrick was a hero or a destroyer. It is whether the past he sought to erase will ever truly stay buried.